Hello everyone. I'm going to talk about the Romantic movement, specifically with regards to British literature. So as you can see here in the title slide, so the Romantic movement was between 1789 and 1832. And of course, as always, these dates are usually not not correct. Well, I mean, by correct, I mean, so there are no sudden changes between Age of Reason to the Romantic movement and then to the Victorian period. Okay, so these are just approximate dates. So last semester we left at the Age of Reason and Enlightenment, or let's say Neoclassicism. So let's start with a small definition of Romanticism. So Romanticism was an intellectual and cultural movement which happened, let's say, which happened in America and in Europe. So Romanticism greatly affected aesthetic and artistic movements in poetry, fiction, music, painting, and it actually reflected the emphasis. It put an emphasis on the individual. I mean the person, the writer, the individual, and the irrational. By I mean illogical things. Okay, the irrational as a source of creativity and truth. So before the Romantic movement, as you know, we have the Enlightenment period, which was between late 17th century and early 19th century. So the Enlightenment emphasized reason, logic. It emphasized the notion that knowledge leads to progress. So the Romantic movement was actually in part, a reaction against the seriousness, the rigidity of the Enlightenment thought. And it raised questions about the use of reason and rationality. The Romantics opposed restrictions on the individual. So what kind of restrictions were those at the time? So there were political restrictions, religious restrictions, or civil restrictions on the individual. So the Romantics opposed all these restrictions, and they believed that these restrictions were because of rationalism. So rationalism belonged to the Enlightenment, so the previous period. Okay, so they opposed these restrictions. So there was the Romantic period was also the rise of the industrial society, which was a consequence of the application of knowledge or empirical knowledge, scientific knowledge to daily life. And this situation, so the industrial society, the rise of industrialization increased the Romantics' belief that the modern world created heightened conditions for the individual's alienation and isolation in the material world. So, not surprisingly, then the movement also reflects changes in philosophy and history. So, what I mean is, Romanticism was not only about literature, but also it was about philosophy and history too. So, uh, the effects of industrialization and modernization on the European people caused some romantics to find to try to survive in an idealized past. Okay, so romantics were therefore they were fascinated by traditional, rural, peasant life, since they believe that identity comes from what is unique and particular rather than from the general. So they preferred custom and tradition to legislation. So the folk, I mean, what I mean here is that they were more concerned, they were more interested in customs, in folk customs, folk traditions, than laws, legislations. And they also rejected the idea of absolute truths. So the Romantics were critical So they criticized modern social changes, and so they wanted to look at the world in a new and different way. So they were kind of revolutionaries in a way. Their approach was mostly anti-rational. Okay, anti-rational. Because again, like I have said before, rationalism was part of neoclassicism or age of reason. But it didn't. But this doesn't mean that they rejected science. Okay, for the Romantics, nature was a product. Nature was not a product, but a process, an organism, rather than a machine, uh, as the people of during Enlightenment thought. Okay, nature was also a source of inspiration, and early Romantics, especially early Romantics, tried to find an ideal union between mankind, nature, and God. So the most widely, so the prominent themes in literature were love, nature, and beauty. So they wanted to find a unity between nature, God, and the individual. On the whole, I mean, the Romantics were introspective. Okay, introspective. They were fascinated by the human potential for creative genius, because as you remember, during the Enlightenment period, during neoclassicism, during neoclassical literature, neoclassical art, what artists cared was they were trying to imitate the classics. By classics, I mean the ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So the neoclassical, the name neoclassical comes from neo, new means it means new, and classical. So the classical, they wanted to renew the classical age. Okay, but here we have the Romantics rebelling against this idea. They believed in the potential of creative, the human potential for creative genius. Okay, instead of imitating the ancients, they wanted to create their own things, their own art. So as a result, they wanted to know what the self, what the self is like. The Romantics uh, the Romantics talked about things like practical reason, fancy, imagination, feeling. Things like these were buzzwords for them. Okay, these were the words that these were the terms that they used so widely. But they believed that the human mind has a special power that goes beyond the limits of passive understanding or knowledge, which is uh, acquired by experiment. Okay, so as described by Enlightenment thinkers. So the Enlightenment, the previous period, in the previous period, the Enlightenment thinkers believed in observing the nature, making experiments, and getting knowledge through these things. But the Romantics believed in knowledge which comes from the mind, from the individual's mind. Okay, arts and literature were important because for the Romantics, because they represented this inner self. For example, music played an important role because, as you know, music is not restricted by physical form or place or time. The world of art, well, including literature, the world of art was an ideal world because art is like a miracle where artistic genius cannot be taught or learned. I mean, you should be born as an artist. And the Romantics put an emphasis on the individual and human emotions, uh, and they were fascinated by these things. The I mean the dreams also, for example, dreams became a popular topic both on art and literature, as for painters. I mean, for painters and writers. Romanticism actually brought a skepticism to the view of modernization and industrialization. along with a mistrust of materialism. So these are the things that I want to say as a brief introduction to this topic. Uh, so, as you remember, so the Enlightenment is the period that comes after the Renaissance period. Okay, so we have the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment, and then Romantic period. Okay, so let's remind ourselves what Enlightenment is. So, Enlightenment was an intellectual movement in France, which started in France and other parts of Europe, that emphasized the importance of reason, progress, liberty. So these were the ideas, these were the slogans, let's say, of enlightenment: reason, progress, liberty. Enlightenment is we can also call the Enlightenment period as the age of reason. Okay, so therefore this period is the writers during Age of Reason or Enlightenment are usually more interested in non-fiction writing. Okay, so fiction versus non-fiction. So fiction is things like poems or novels. Okay, but they were interested in non-fiction. I mean, things like essays, for example. Okay, or philosophical treatises like essays. I mean, so major Enlightenment writers include Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and René Descartes. Okay, so this is what Enlightenment was about. Enlightenment was about using your reason, believing in reason, progress, and liberty. So neoclassicism, as you can notice, neoclassicism takes place around the same time as Age of Reason, because Age of Reason or Enlightenment is mostly about political and philosophical ideas, but neoclassicism is the writing style, or let's say artistic style, which was used during Age of Reason. Okay, so neoclassicism, I'm repeating myself. So neoclassicism was an artistic movement, but Age of Reason was a philosophical and political movement. Okay, but they happened at the same time. So neoclassicism, as I have just mentioned, it has two separate words: neo, which means new, and classicism. So the classics are the ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the works written by those people. So the writers during that period, the classics, let's say, they emphasized things like balance, restraint, order. So for example, what do I mean by these? So by balance, restraint, and order, I mean things like there were some topics which were taboo topics during ancient Greece and ancient Rome, during the literature of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So some topics were worthy of art and some topics were not worthy of art. Okay, so you had to balance your writing, you had to restrain your feelings, you had to have an order in the form of your writing during ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So neoclassical writers wanted to imitate them. Okay, so neoclassicism coincides with the Enlightenment and it espouses reason over passion. So passion is more like a human emotion. Okay, so but reason must restrain passion. That's what the neoclassical writers thought. So notable neoclassical writers include Edmund Burke, John Dryden, Samuel Johnson, Alexander Pope, and Jonathan Swift. We have discussed some of those writers in the last semester. Okay, let's come to Romanticism then. So Romanticism was a literary and artistic movement that reacted against the restraint and universalism of the Enlightenment. So what do I mean by universalism? So the Enlightenment thinkers thought that knowledge was universal, which means what is good for so there is one single truth. That's what they thought. Okay, the good things or the bad things were universal. They applied to everyone. Okay, but romantics, So what does this thing leave out? It leaves out the individual. So a person's individual experience is definitely different than the next person. Okay, so the Romantics opposed this universalism, this idea of universalism. So what did they support then? So they reacted against the restraint and universalism, but what did they support? So the Romantics supported spontaneity, imagination, subjectivity, and the purity of nature. So notable important English Romantic writers were Jane Austen, William Blake, Lord Byron, Coleridge, John Keats, Percy B. Shelley, and William Wordsworth. And in the American continent, we have Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and Edgar Allan Poe. So we can summarize the ideas of Romanticism in 5 major themes. So intuition was the first one. Intuition is the truth of the heart. It is more trustworthy than reason. So intuition is like your inner voice. So you reach your intuition, or you come to a conclusion. Without using your reason, your logic, your brain. Okay, your your inner voice tells you that something is true. Okay, think about a detective story, for example. Okay, or let's imagine that you are a detective. So if you use your reason, if you use your logic, when you are trying to solve a mystery as a detective, you need proof. Okay, for example, you need to find the murder weapon. Okay, you need to observe the victim. You need to find clues. So these are the things that you use your reason. But with intuition, your inner voice tells you who the murderer is. Okay, so that's the main difference between intuition and reason. So intuition is the truth of the heart, or your inner voice. So Romantics also believed that uh, expressing your own experience, expressing your individual experience is more important, more valuable than universal principles. All right. So they were interested in the experience of the individual, not the society, not the community, okay, not the universal values. So also the individual is at the center of life, and God is at the center of the individual. So that was the third romantic theme that they believed in. So the individual is at the center of life, and God is at the center of the individual. So you see here a reversal of the roles of enlightenment here, or let's say, I mean, even before enlightenment, you see a reversal of the roles here during Renaissance or during medieval age. Okay, because here we have God, in those times, in the past, we had God at the center of life. Okay, God is at the top, and then we have the individual at the bottom. Okay, but here the individual is at the center of life. So the individual, the person, is the most important thing, and God is within us. So that definitely is in conflict with the ideas of the church, of course, okay? Because the church, for example, says that God is a separate thing from you, okay? There is God and there is you. But here we have, no, God is within me. So what does that lead to? This also leads to the idea that you can create your own belief system, okay? Religious beliefs. Uh, so nature is an array of physical symbols from which knowledge of the supernatural can be intuited. So this is kind of difficult to understand. What it means is they believed that nature, or the physical world, let's say, it carries some signs. Okay, And by observing these signs, we can understand the truth. We can reach knowledge. We can have knowledge. We can understand things. What I mean is, for example, you are looking at the sunrise. You are watching the sunrise at 5 o'clock in the morning, for example, and you see how majestic that is. Okay, so you start to believe, and you hear the birds singing, and then slowly the rain starts to fall. Okay, so you are subjected to this imagery, and you start to believe that well, there is a God. Okay, so you have reached a conclusion through your own experience. Okay, because during the previous ages, during the previous periods, we had the Bible telling us that there was a God. Okay, but here we have the individual observing the signs in the nature and reaching a conclusion that God exists. Okay, but of course that's not only about God. I mean, this is not only about religious knowledge. You can use these signs in order to reach other types of knowledge as well about the world. So you should aspire to the ideal. So the final theme, we should aspire to the ideal. I mean, to change what is to what ought to be. So as I have told you, the Romantics were kind of revolutionaries. So they were idealistic people. So they believed that the world can be a better place. So in the previous period, during Enlightenment, people believed that there was the natural world, the universe, the world, let's say, and your job was to make experiments on it. Okay, and your job was to understand it. But here during Romantic period, so it's not enough to understand nature, it's not enough to understand society, it's not enough to understand the world. Your job is to change it. So change it how? Change it to better. Okay, so these were the 5 main Romantic themes. All right, so there were also many social and political changes during Renaissance, and we can say that these changes also contributed to the start of Romanticism. So, for example, in England, of course, I'm going to focus on England. So this period was a period of great change in England. Well, agricultural society was making way. I mean, agricultural society was being destroyed by industrial society. So England was becoming an industrial society and losing its agricultural society. So therefore, so what did this lead to? For example, by the industrial society contributed to pollution, for example. Okay, air pollution. I mean, the pollution of nature. They cut the trees to make room for factories. Also, people who are living in the countryside, I mean, people who were peasants, they had to move to the cities in order to be factory workers. Okay, so there were great changes in England at the time. There were American Revolution and French Revolution, which also they happened at this time. The American Revolution is, as you know, the independence of America from England. So they stopped being a colony of a British colony, and they became an independent country, America. And then we have the French Revolution, where the people of France killed their king and they established the republic. Okay, so they wanted to rule themselves instead of being ruled by a king. So what are these things examples of? So these two revolutions are examples of idealism that I have just mentioned in the previous slide. So idealism is the idea to make things better, to put the things in an ideal state. So American people and French people, they wanted to do the ideal thing. So they wanted to change the world. So that's why they made some revolutions. All right. What else? So mill towns grew during this period. What is a mill town? A mill is a different name for a factory town. A factory town is a town where there is a factory, of course, and most of the people who are living in this town are factory workers. Okay, so the overwhelming number of people who are constituting the workforce in this country are factory workers. Okay, so it's like the factory is established first, and then the town is built around the factory. Okay, because you need people who because when you have a factory, you need people to work in the factory as workers. But these factory workers also have their families. Okay, so you need to build them houses as well. So they start living around the factory. So that's the definition of a mill town, let's say. Okay, but of course these mill towns were destroying nature during the Romantic period, and that's why the Romantic writers, the Romantic artists, or the Romantic painters, they were very much against this destruction of nature. So that's why they, in their paintings, for example, they mostly so one of their favorite topics was actually nature. Okay, uh, so there were some reforms actually, but they did not occur very easily, or let's say they occurred very slowly because there was this idea. I mean, because the capitalism at that time, the application of capitalism at that time was the idea was let them do what they want. Okay, so you want to earn some money. Okay, you can do anything. I mean, that was the idea. Okay, so you can destroy the nature, or you can pay very little money to your workers. So there were no rules, there were no regulations regarding capitalism at that time. Okay, so these regulations were introduced later in Europe, of course. So because there were no rules, there were very low wages for factory workers. The working conditions were terrible. Many women and children were working in very difficult conditions. Okay, so there were children miners, as you can see here. But of course, wherever there are such problems, people also start rebelling against these things. So there were many protests, many riots during this period. Okay, so these riots, these protests are also part of the idealism idea of the Romanticism as well. Okay, so the worker protests, things like those. Okay, so women's situation was also very bad as well. So they were undereducated. I mean, they did not have the same education as men. They had limited job opportunities. They were subject to a strict code of sexual behavior. So I'm sorry, I made a typo here, behavior. So they had to live in a strict code of sexual behavior, and they had no legal rights. Okay, in spite of these things, the women's rights issue was largely ignored, at least at the beginning. All right, so let's talk about poetry with regards to the Romantic period. So William Wordsworth was a British poet, and he was probably the most famous Romantic poet. So you should always remember his name, William Wordsworth. So he published an anthology of poems called The Lyrical Ballads. So he published this book twice, one of these books were published in 1800 and the other one in 1802. Okay, so but in the preface to his lyrical ballads, there is a very famous definition of poetry, and we can say that this definition is like the definition of poetry according to the Romantics. So he said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. So let's go step by step. So poetry should be spontaneous, which means poetry should be sudden. Poetry should be without thinking. Okay, why? Because according to the neoclassics, neoclassical writers, neoclassical poets, poetry should be planned. Okay, you should plan what you are going to write about. But no, he says, William Wordsworth, poetry should be spontaneous. Overflow of powerful feelings. So poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So poetry should not be about any regular kind of feeling, but it should be about a powerful feeling. Okay? And these feelings should be so powerful that they should overflow. Okay? And recollected in tranquility. So recollected means remembered. So remembered in tranquility or remembered in peace. So suppose that you are out there in nature as a romantic poet. You just experience, you observe the scene that I have just mentioned you a couple of slides ago. So you are watching the sunrise, for example, at 5 o'clock in the morning, and you start to hear the birds singing, and then suddenly rain starts. Okay, so you are spontaneously or you are suddenly filled with powerful feelings, but you should not start writing your poem just then. Okay, you should remember them. You should go home, remember that scene, and you should be at peace. You should be at peace at your home, and then remember that time when you observed the sunrise, and then you should write your poem. Okay, so therefore poetry is the spontaneous or sudden overflow of powerful feelings remembered in peace. That's what he means. And then let's talk about nature. So as I have said, romantics put so much emphasis on nature because why? Nature was being destroyed as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and nature was the work of God. Therefore, nature was full of signs from God. Okay, so nature was seen as a system of symbols revealing the nature of God. Therefore you should be close with nature. We should not lose our connection to nature because we are part of nature, and therefore as we move away from nature, as we start as we sever our connection with nature, we lose our connection with God and we lose our connection with nature. So therefore, humble, rustic subject matter and plain style became the principal subject and medium of poetry. So in the previous period, in the neoclassical period, we had stories, we had poems which were about grand things, okay, not humble things. There were stories about gods, there were stories about kings, but now we don't have that. With the Romanticism, we have poems, we have stories about ordinary people, humble stories, okay? Rustic subject matter. Rustic means related to the countryside, okay? And plain style became the principal subject. So by plain style, I mean the word choice, okay? The word choice. So the words should be plain. So poetry should be understood by everyone. That's what the Romantics believed. So the supernatural and strange. So many romantic poems, many romantic poets and writers liked exploring mysterious subjects, magical subjects, folkloric subjects, superstitions, ghost stories, vampire stories, Gothic stories, or they wrote about stories which took place in exotic places, okay, in distant places, in faraway places. Um, there was also an interest in the Middle Ages and the ballad form, because the ballad form is the form which belonged to the common people. Ballad means türkü in Turkish, okay? So and ballads belong to ordinary people. Okay, so and they are not planned, but they pass on from generation to generation. Therefore, they had interest in the ballad form, and they had interest in the Middle Ages stories, chivalric stories, things like that. There were also some poets and writers who kind of um, liked using the drugs. Okay, by drugs I mean the drugs that put them in hallucinatory situations. Okay, in different modes of experience. Okay, hypnotism, dreams, drug-induced states, and so on and so forth. Okay, so therefore, as I have said previously, they were interested in dreams as well. Okay, so they used these different kinds of they liked writing when they were under the influence of drugs sometimes. So during the Age of Reason or Enlightenment, the neoclassical writers, the neoclassical artists were mostly, they were not interested in the individual. Okay, they were interested in greater subjects. They were interested in the societies. Okay, so but as the Romantics were more interested in the individual, they believed, they had to believe that people, that human beings were by birth they were noble and good, but then why is there so much pain and suffering in society? Because they believe that people are corrupted by society. Okay, because of their desire to earn money, for example, or their desire to earn power, for example. So but they were essentially good. So when they were born, when we are born, we are good and noble. uh, that's what they believed in. And therefore, because people were good, according to them, because people were good, they deserved a better, they deserved better rules. They deserved better uh, people to rule them. Therefore, they started to believe in democratic ideals. They believed in human liberty. Okay, and they, for example, look at French Revolution. So they believed that monarchy was a form of tyranny, and they got rid of their king. So because there is nothing more important than the individual experience. Well, an extreme side of that belief in the individual was that they sometimes, these poets and writers, they isolated themselves from society, or they wrote about characters, they created characters which isolated themselves from society. So therefore the theme of exile, for example, was common in Romantic literature. So an exile is a person who is living away from society, who is living alone, for example, in the woods or in the mountains. Okay, and out there he is alone and in connection with nature and God. So exile, therefore, either they exiled themselves or they exiled their characters. We can say that there are 5 I's in Romanticism. So Romanticism is characterized by the 5 I's. So these are imagination, intuition, idealism, inspiration, and individuality. So there are 5 words that we can use when we are talking about Romanticism, which start with the letter I. So the first of those ideas is imagination. So imagination is more important than reason. Okay, especially when you're talking about literature. I mean, instead of using your reason, you should use your imagination. That's what they believed in. Because this was a reaction against the rationalism, the logic, the rationalism of the neoclassical period, which came before the Romantic period. Imagination is essential in order to create art. Uh, the other one is intuition. So I have just explained you intuition at the beginning of this presentation. So intuition is the method that you use when you are using your instead of your mind, you use your inner voice. Okay. The other one is idealism. So idealism is the opposite of realism. Okay, so the idealist person tries to change the world. Okay, so when I say he's such an idealist teacher, what do I mean? I mean that this teacher goes to a remote village school in order to teach his or her poor students. Okay, so he doesn't stay in the city. He doesn't like the he doesn't choose to stay in the city and enjoy the comforts of the city and friends and family, but instead he goes alone to a village school to teach poor children. So this is an example of idealism. Okay, so idealism is apparent when we're talking about Romanticism. Idealism is apparent in revolutions, basically. Okay, because these American revolutions and the American Revolution and the French Revolution, for example, are all examples of idealism. The desire to change a revolution, the desire to create a revolution and change the world and turn it into an ideal place, a better place. The other one is inspiration. So the romantic artist, musician, or writer is an inspired creator rather than a technical master. So a technical master is a term that we can use when we are talking about neoclassical literature, because instead of inspiration and imagination and individualism, the neoclassical poets or writers, they were like mechanics. Okay, instead of poets, they were more like mechanics because they wanted to imitate the ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and they counted their syllables, their syllables, for example, when they are writing poetry, and they were so careful with the sound, the musicality of their poems, or they chose their topics very carefully, so in order not to offend anyone, for example. But the romantics were not interested in being a technical master or an engineer. They wanted to be creators when they were creating art. And in order to create something artistically, you need inspiration. The final one is individuality. As you have so far learned, romantics celebrated the individual rather than the society. Things like women's rights and evolutionism. Evolutionism is the end of slavery. Okay, so you find in these movements the movement for evolutionism and the women's rights movement. You find this individuality. I mean, the idea that the individual should be free. They should not be dependent on another person, be it man or be it a king, for example, or a slave master. All right. So in terms of visual arts, let's talk about visual arts. So what are visual arts? Visual arts are artistic representations such as paintings, okay, or sculptures. So the neoclassical art, the art of the previous period, was rigid, severe, unemotional, and it was an imitation of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So it was calculated. It was like the paintings were almost like not created by an artist, but imitated by an engineer. Okay, so but the romantics were not like that. They were individualistic, they were emotional, they were exotic, and they were revolutionary, they were new. So therefore they were like the romantic artists were like reacting against neoclassicism. In order to understand easily or more easily, we can look at some paintings. So on the left side, you see a neoclassical painting called The Death of Marat. So Jean-Paul Marat was a journalist during the French Revolution, and he was murdered. And in this is a neoclassical painting, and you see here how the individual here is stylized and idealized. Okay, you see there's a different kind of symmetry where the top half of the painting is almost empty, but on the bottom side there's the figure, there's the dead body. So, and he is murdered in a bathtub actually. And if you, I mean, if we zoom on the paper that the dead body is holding, there's an inspirational writing regarding the French Revolution on this piece of paper. So again, this neoclassical painting is more interested in ideas, in great activities. Okay, let's look at the right side. So you see a shipwreck during a storm, and there are people on smaller boats who are trying to evacuate the ship. So you see here, we can say that this is a romantic art because it doesn't look very realistic, because the style, especially when you compare it to the neoclassical painting, it's not very easy to distinguish the individuals in this painting. So you can see here, so the left side painting, the neoclassical painting, could also be similar, can also be compared to a photograph, right? It's quite realistic. But the right side photo, the romantic painting, is not very realistic because the painter has put his own imagination and ideas into his style. And the thing that also makes this a romantic painting is that it's talking about the power of nature, as you see, because there's a very big storm and mankind is powerless against nature. Okay, let's talk about these two paintings. So again, on the left side, you see a neoclassical painting, and on the right side, you see a romantic painting. The neoclassical painting is about two important people, okay? But the right side painting, and therefore it's a neoclassical painting. Again, you can see that all this painting is almost photographic. But the right side painting is, again, it takes place in the nature. Even though there are two people in it, they are not in the focus. But when you look at this painting, you are immediately drawn to the nature. Okay, when you compare to the neoclassical painting, in the neoclassical painting you focus on the people, but on the romantic painting on the right side you focus on nature. And this is an exotic place. We can say that this is an exotic place. This is an unknown place. We don't know where it is. So that's why this is a romantic painting. A very famous painting by Caspar David Friedrich entitled "Men and Women Contemplating the Moon." So you see here again the depiction of nature is quite dark, pessimistic, it's almost scary. It's like there are some supernatural things about it's almost like there are going to be some supernatural events going to happen. So these two people are, again, they are not in the they are not the main highlights of this painting, because the moon and the tree, maybe the forest, the dark forest, is in the focus of this painting. And as you see here, the men and women are not very important in this painting. The people are not very important because their backs are turned to us. Okay, this one. So this one is by a Norwegian painter. So this Norwegian painter has painted a historical painting, let's say. So here you see a Viking ship, okay, a Viking ship. And because, as I have told you before, the Romantics were sometimes drawn to the Middle Ages, and therefore common people, the Middle Ages, the folklore, things like that were their interest. And here you see such a painting. You see a Viking ship. You see on the left side, I hope you are able to see it. So this is a very beautiful nature painting. And there's also a very small person and a child and a dog in it as well on the left side. Okay, so but they're all very small. So again, the people are not the most important thing, but the nature is the most important thing. Here, this is probably a painting that you have seen before. It's liberty leading the people. So liberty is the personification, is personified by a woman here. So again, this is a romantic painting because it talks about idealism. So this painting depicts a moment, an imaginary, of course, an imaginary moment from the French Revolution. So the woman here, called Liberty, here personified as Liberty, is leading the people with the French flag, and those people in the back have their guns, and they are walking over the soldiers of the king, and they're out on their way to create a better society. So you see, this is also a romantic painting. This is called Sunrise in Syria. So again, you see here nature. You see nature here in this painting, and on the bottom right side, there's a very small human being as well. So again, when you compare with the neoclassical paintings, romantic painters did not like focusing on people, but they tried to focus on nature. And again, this painting is called Sunrise in Syria. So the painter probably has never been to Syria in his life. But as I have told you before, romantic painters and writers were interested in remote settings, in exotic places, in faraway places. And that's why this is his imagination of Syria. And you see here some monuments, some ruins, but in this painting as well. I mean, as well as nature, you see some man-made objects as well, mainly the temple, the ruins of the temple, and the castle and in the background, but they are all in ruins. So this is also another thing which makes this painting a romantic painting, because man-made things are, the message here is that man-made things are powerless in the face of nature. Okay, nature consumes them. So whatever you do in this world, I mean, man-made objects will never survive in nature. Another very famous painting, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Clouds by Caspar David Friedrich. So in this painting, you see a man, and he's quite in the focus here because he's in the middle of the painting. But then you see that when you look longer, when you observe this painting for a longer time, you see that again he is not the focus here, because the nature in the background is more powerful here. So again, his back is turned to us. So he has probably exiled himself. We can speculate that he has exiled himself, and the title is The Wanderer Above the Sea of Clouds. The wanderer means somebody who is wandering alone. Who is walking, who is going about alone by himself. All right. So even though there is a person in this painting, the main reason that this painting is made is not to show the wanderer or the person, but to emphasize the power of nature. All right, so that's about it about Romanticism. So Romanticism is, as I have told you before, was a intellectual movement, a cultural movement, which started both in America and in Europe, and which was a reaction against neoclassicism. And when Romanticism ended, we have realism, by the way. So because of, maybe you have noticed, but all those literary movements are usually are reactions against each other. Okay, so for example, we have the Middle Ages, literature, the literature of the Middle Ages, and then we have Renaissance literature, which is quite a reaction against the rigidity of the Middle Ages, the seriousness of the Middle Ages. And then we have neoclassicism. And then as a reaction to it, we have Romanticism. And then as a reaction to Romanticism, we will have realism. So that's about it. If you have any questions about Romanticism in general, you can send me an email. Thank you for listening.